Bra, då ska vi med en varm applåd hälsa vi nästa talare välkommen upp. Välkommen upp, Kenneth De Spiegeleire. I'm going to switch over to English. You represent Dropbox, that, in my view, that has to be one of the most hated companies in the IT departments, isn't it? We've been talking about shadow IT during this conference, and you symbolize shadow IT. All the employees bring in their own Dropbox accounts, and data is all over suddenly.
Hated is not the word I was hoping for, Bob.
Oh, okay.
I have to admit. Let's come up with something better than hated. I don't think we are, and I hope I'll be able to make that clear in the next 20 to 30 minutes. It is true that we very much come from a consumer pedigree. I'd like to think we have a relentless obsession about what users really want and need. And coming from that consumer world, there can be a perception that somehow we're an enemy or a threat to the business, but hopefully I'll be able to persuade you otherwise in the next half hour or so.
Good manners is not my strong point, so I'm going to ask another rude question, but you don't have to answer it if you don't like to. I'm just curious, do you have stock options?
I do have stock options.
Okay. So you're a very rich man, I assume.
Not yet. You know, that's the problem with pre-IPO companies. It could be worth a lot. It could be worth absolutely nothing.
So, but on paper, at least, you're very rich.
We should speak about my speaking fee after this, though. You know, just to supplement my income.
Okay, the stage is yours, Kenneth.
Thank you very much. Thank you, and thank you for the warm welcome. Is there a clicker, by the way? I forgot to ask. Thank you. Fantastic. So, talking today to you about cloud, I'm sure you would expect me to perhaps give you some insights about Silicon Valley, or talk about some of the new innovation hotspots in Asia, or perhaps talk about the startup ecosystem here in Stockholm or Berlin, or the Silicon Roundabout in London. And I'm going to do none of those things because I know I'm somewhere between the coffee break, which is already a distant memory. You're already starting to think about lunch. So rather than giving you a typical vendor pitch, I'll try to insert a bit of light entertainment and keep you on your toes and keep you surprised. So rather than these fancy startup environments, I'd like to start here. Does anyone know where this is or what this is? Falun, yes, that's right. I tried with 3 Swedes in the office and none of them knew it. So you're much more educated. CV applications are accepted. You're much more educated than my fellow collaborators at work. So that's indeed Falun. I have to admit, I had to look it up on a map exactly where it is. So I understand it's about 220 kilometers from here. And you're probably wondering by now, why on earth is this cloud guy talking about a copper mine in the center of Sweden? I'll tell you why. So I was really surprised to learn that Falun is the oldest recorded instance of an industrial endeavor. So there's actually a record going back to about 1288 talking about this thing. And over the centuries, it became part of, I think, a company called Stora. And so as a result, there are some who say that actually Stora Enso, as it is now known today, is the oldest industrial company in the world. And it's, of course, in the meantime, turned itself into much more of a modern, diversified giant. And I thought it was just an incredible story. So I still see you wonder, why on earth is he still talking about this? Well, there is something that we have observed, which is that the likes of Stora Enso have very much become an exception. Companies have shorter and shorter lifespans. And so in the last century, we've seen that companies that maybe in the 1920s, as part of the S&P 500, so the index of leading companies, they might have had an average lifespan of about 67 years in the 1920s. But as of today, that average lifespan for a leading company is as short as 15 years. And I have to admit, I had an inkling, you see this in the literature. I was surprised to see how short this has become, almost slightly worrying. And for most of us sitting here, if we fast forward maybe 5 to 7 years, think forward to the early 2020s, about 75% of companies in the S&P 500, here all of us in this room will not even have heard of today. So that gave some food for thought. And then secondly, I was starting to wonder, so what can you do then how do you then become successful? How can you be a company that can last longer and somehow rejuvenate on a regular basis, or almost constantly? And so I came across this study, which is not recent at all, so you can see it's something that's preoccupied people for quite a long time. It happens to be done by a bunch of people at Royal Dutch Shell Group, Shell as it is known today. And they try to figure out those companies that are consistently successful and manage to rejuvenate themselves. What do they do differently? And it turns out these companies had 4 factors broadly in common. And I won't bore you with all the background behind each of them, but it's quite interesting to see that very few of them actually had anything to do with the real mechanics of the business, had more to do with being sensitive to their environment, somehow managed to come up with a cohesive identity, something that would be constant across the decades. And given that I'm originally from Belgium, I'm going to try really hard now not to make jokes about Dutch researchers talking about conservative financing and not spending a lot of money, but I think I just gave a hint. And then there's finally also something like tolerance, which I thought was a very strange word to come across. And the tolerance was really about an ability to somehow accommodate diversity of skill sets, diversity of opinions within the company. And the corollary, which is then in many of these successful companies, decentralization, empowering people locally at the most appropriate level where you're closest to customers to actually make most of the decisions. So this for me was a real hint, a first hint about the importance of collaboration and how, you know, cloud, which can be a fantastic enabler for collaboration, can play a role here. So I'll park this for now. Alongside this, a second observation that we spent some time thinking about is that somehow it seems that big is no longer as beautiful. If you think about the industry leaders, and I'm taking the tech industry as an example here, and you think back to these companies that were both founded around the 1900s, believe it or not, one just before, one just after, growing into industry leaders, they managed to accumulate hundreds of thousands of employees over time. And it seemed there was a general recipe for success that a company had to grow and grow to get to a massive scale, to be able to better leverage assets across diversified business lines within a conglomerate, to become successful and really exert its influence through a big physical presence and a big physical footprint and employee base. And then as you fast forward through the years, and I've really tried to objectively take examples and not just examples that, you know, fit my argument. I do find it really striking that over time, companies that you would still, I think, consider today as industry leaders have over time somehow in their physical footprint become smaller and smaller. And you're talking about the low tens of thousands and maybe even high thousands in number in terms of employees. So again, I see you think, where on earth is this guy going with this? Well, for me, the logical consequence, what you then observe, is that for these companies to be successful, still generating these enormous revenues and operating at scale, you see higher and higher dependencies on external ecosystems, partners, vendors, communities that they leverage more effectively. And I find that as you go from the left to the right, a lot of these companies seem to focus a lot more on what is core to their operations and really focus on doing that really well. And whatever is context, you push towards external parties that you still somehow are very dependent on and interdependent with. Aha, so there we go. Again, that theme of the importance of collaboration coming through. So then as time passes, and I was just going to say, I don't mean to sketch this as a black and white picture, so that would obviously be a lie. I just did. And this is not an either or, but what we have seen is that as a result, in parallel, we have seen a lot of moves from generally closed innovation ecosystems to much more open innovation ecosystems. And you're a very educated audience, so I'm not going to bore you with things you already know. So let me switch immediately through to maybe a few practical examples of this that we have as Dropbox also observed and participated in from very close by. So let me maybe take product platforms as an example, which I think is an interesting example. A product platform, ultimately what happens is that creators generally put forward something that is actually half finished. And they invite other contributors who will hopefully help establish a broader platform, a toolkit. And it's one of those cases where you see network effects being really powerful. Because the more developers you manage to attract to your platform, the better the solution and the product will become, and the more developers in turn will come and contribute. And so when I look at some of these instances where open innovation has really moved forward, the thing that strikes me is when we talk about collaboration, I think often we have this feeling it's a bunch of people just exchanging information, talking to each other. At best, you'll find some soft productivity benefits. And for me, behind each of those forms, you actually see really successful examples of hard business, positive business returns being achieved. And you can almost look at entire industries that literally would not exist today, I think, without some of these ecosystems having been created. And so I'll just give you a personal example to make this a bit more real. I actually lived in Switzerland for quite a few years, and as a result, you deal with a lot of banks and pharmaceutical companies. It's inevitable. You just stumble across them all the time. And so dealing with quite a few pharmaceutical firms, I don't know about you, I don't know how many of you have actual experience with pharma firms. Casinos have nothing on them. It's like a big gambling tent. It is absolutely incredible. And I take my hat off. Talking to some of the heads of development who are under pressure to find the new big blockbuster drug, these people will spend $1 billion over 12 to 15 years to take one of those things to market. And it's a gamble. When you start that journey as a pharmaceutical research guy, you have no idea whether this stuff is actually going to work. They tend to literally sieve through 6,000 compounds on average just to try and find ultimately maybe 10 that will go to clinical trial. And then if you don't end up killing too many people, then maybe one of them will be a good drug that you can ultimately take to market. Spending $1 million a week on developing something that might have no returns. So you can imagine if you run that kind of organization, trying to somehow compress these development life cycles is pretty important. You need to tap into a lot of expertise all over the globe. And rather than, and I loved what Lars was saying, well, I didn't understand most of what has been said this morning, in fairness, but thankfully the slides were in English. I believe one of the things he said is that we're kind of tired talking about cloud. Let's talk about the benefits of cloud, and the specific instance I'm looking at here, collaborative cloud. These benefits for pharma companies are real, because by investing in innovation networks, in real collaborative cloud solutions, if they manage to compress these development life cycles by maybe as little as a month, that's an enormous amount of money saved. And think about the fact they can bring the drug earlier to market, a month, 2 months. That actually represents tens of millions of dollars for a company like that. So soft productivity benefits, they ain't, but real business returns, I would say. And then I thought a couple of customers that are very good Dropbox customers. We know them. We know them very well. Again, to give you some real examples, what we have then noticed: these companies that really embrace collaborative cloud as part of their business really start setting the pace and start outpacing competitors quite tremendously, actually, over time. And looking at News Corp, looking at the media industry as a whole, Alexandra will probably testify. It's not an easy place to be in the media and publishing industry, to have that continuous fight for eyeballs, if you like. And so News Corp is a company, tremendously successful company that's gone through many, many changes. They've taken truly iconic brands that they have tried to massively move towards digital subscriptions, which again was an enormous gamble. At the same time, they have to somehow connect 25,000 employees in 10 completely different businesses, and they've publicly stated an ambition to take 75% of their computing power into the cloud. So I really take my hat off for the IT team that's trying to achieve this. And I thought I couldn't address an audience like this without having a proud Swedish brand like Absolut, which I think is another example of a company that has really done a tremendous job of leveraging the collaborative cloud. Because they're probably best known, I think, abroad as well for their their fantastic, innovative, and really persistent advertising campaigns, building an amazing brand that way. But I think what a lot of people maybe don't know, if you start looking under the cover, they've invested a lot in creating really this kind of collaborative network, investing a lot in cooperation with musicians, with artists, with all sorts of people they see as connectors and that can become real advocates for their brand. So 2 examples of companies that we've really see embrace the collaborative cloud for business benefit. I'll go 1 level deeper still, just to show that this is not all a little bit of marketing hype. So if you then start looking at those companies, and maybe sticking, as I just talked about News Corp, sticking with the media industry, here you see an example of a major publisher, and we're together here doing a quick deep dive into one of their workflows. Because again, this is not just about connecting a bunch of people and hoping for the best. This is the kind of company that will look at one process like advertising buying. So you're looking here at their advertising buying workflow, which before they embraced the cloud was an absolute nightmare. I mean, you cannot believe how they go about this. You have account teams going out to tender, responding to RFPs. There were hundreds of documents floating back and forth because you're talking about ad campaigns that you're trying to generate. There's obviously a lot of interaction between different people, lots of different opinions, documents being turned back and forth, physical CDs, DVD shipped. You can't believe how iterative and time-consuming a process this can be. And to see a company actually embrace an IT tool, a cloud tool ultimately, to bake it into the heart of a workflow is actually a really, really cool thing to see, I have to say. And again, the productivity benefits, the time savings, the cost benefits that they get out of this are enormous. And so then if I then lift it back up a level, this is just one workflow for one company in one industry. If you then start aggregating the benefits of different workflows in one company, and we've tried to visualize this a bit more simply for you and hopefully a bit more elegantly here. So sticking with the media sector and looking here at one of the big 5 book publishers. So imagine they sit in the middle. You see here a visualization of when they really embrace technology like this, how this really takes off. So you see, for example, some of the distributors there in purple, then suppliers both in green and red, some of them content related and some of them not. Then you have, the content suppliers there on that side, agencies here. The other blue ones are other industry leaders that they interact with in some shape or form. And there are 3 things that really surprise us. One is the actual speed. So in the media sector alone, so worldwide, 1 in every 5 media professionals now sits on Dropbox, which is, when I heard the statistic, it literally blew my mind, I have to say. The second thing is, collaboration, as I said in the title, really very quickly becomes contagious. So what we see is people that start using it, it really becomes almost part and parcel of their everyday life. So we see people who use it connect to Dropbox over 100 times a day. And I think sometimes even subconsciously it becomes, as I said before, part of the workflow. And even the smallest of companies who become part of this kind of cloud will over time connect with at least 7 other companies. That's what we've seen. And the larger they become, the higher that number will be, of course. So for larger enterprises, it will be over 100 other companies that they collaborate with. And collaborate here means, by the way, shared folders. This is actual information, data, documents, stuff being exchanged between those companies. It's not a bunch of people IMing each other, just to be clear. So, this all sounds good, Kenneth. This all sounds wonderful, but does it actually yield any benefits? And for the cynical among you, you might say, well, you know, the guy's bread is buttered. You know, he's a vendor of cloud services, so of course he will say it's amazing and fantastic. And you know, that's why you bring in hopefully some third-party endorsements. And I have to say, so to me, it seems quite convincing by now, working with the majority of our customers, that yes, the benefits are there in terms of cost savings. But I think, as Jos also said from PostNord and Anders noted on from IDC, ultimately, I think more of the benefits really have to do with if you can somehow serve the business better, and it helps accelerate revenues. It helps you move faster. It makes you more agile, which I realize agility is yet another beautifully overused word. So again, I gave you the example of the pharmaceutical company. I'll give you a different example in an entirely different industry to, again, make this very concrete. Oil and gas, for example. I'm not an oil and gas expert. I know you have a few next door neighbors to the west who know a thing or two about oil and gas exploration. But what I do know, it's an industry that functions in an incredible way. So going to try and explore for new sources of oil and gas is an extremely difficult, capital-intense thing to do. And I don't know if you know this, but if you drill for oil, if your drill bit is positioned even by 0.1 degrees differently, just a tiny little different inclination, that can influence your extraction ratios by 3, 5, 7%. So getting that angle absolutely right is a terrifically difficult thing to do. And the thing is, let's face it, you know, people going to university today, oil and gas is probably not quite as sexy anymore as it used to be. Geophysics is probably not #1 on the list of hot university topics that people want to go and study. And so you have a rapidly aging industry. These kind of geophysical specialists are on average about 53, 54 years old, and not being replenished as an employee base. So they're very much in demand, and they can't possibly travel around to all these countries. So imagine those specialists being able to use collaborative cloud, real-time data exchange to look at the seismic and geophysical data, and be able to do that for 17 different wells that are being spudded around the globe in one day, rather than having to travel. So just to give you another real example. So and then what we observe at Dropbox is this kind of thing. You always have to have some fancy graphics that are not immediately meaningful, but allow me to continue to talk to you. And they are actually pretty meaningful, but what we've then noticed is lifting it back up a level, not at company or organization level anymore, we're starting to see all these amazing collaborations between different, almost like layers of society, with universities interacting with companies, and then even with government. So even with public sector, we're actually starting to see quite a lot of traction. And so it's just amazing to see that network basically grow over time, now spanning 200 countries, and in more than 50 countries we actually have over a million users. And this is what it kind of results in. We have a visualization department that goes wild, as you can see. You know, so when I said it's a universe of collaboration, this is one visualization. This is real, I have to tell you, right? So this is the Fortune 1000 companies that use Dropbox with all of the interconnections they have with companies around them. So this is kind of a visualization of 160,000 different connections between companies. Now, in order to make sure that they seem two very lovely people, in order not to upset Alexandra and Bo, I will now start wrapping up, and I think you always wrap up with a call to action. The first one is one that people might not often say to you. I'd like you to overcome your naked ape. Hands up if anyone has ever said that to you. Probably not. I read a lot of random things, as my colleagues up there will tell you, and Desmond Morris was one of my early heroes. He's a fantastic biologist from Oxford University, and so he kind of laid the foundation, a bunch of research, whereby he says, as a result of our own biological limitations, the neocortex up here, we can't handle more than 150 relationships. Maybe you've heard of Dunbar's number that actually builds kind of research. And I kind of have this belief that as an organization as well, unless there is some technology enablement, I think as a company it's difficult. You probably have a Dunbar number as well, a limitation of how you can effectively interact with, transact with other organizations that make you economically successful. Secondly, we do have a conscious bias when it comes to that trade-off between usability and security, and if in doubt, we'll probably default to the safe choice. And I'm, by the way, I can't believe I'm now admitting this on stage, I'm a cryptographer by trade before I joined the dark side and became a salesman. And so I do really deeply care about security, but I also know that if you make it hard for your users, they will find ways to circumvent it. And ask yourself honestly, I used to be the guy who in paranoid fashion would burn things on CDs and stick it away at home in safes, etc. And now I, without any reluctance, put everything on Dropbox, because ultimately, do I secure my iMac at home better than a dedicated provider will do? I'm not so sure. So I think taking those things together, if I've even 1% convinced you more about the benefits of cloud, and especially collaborative cloud, then talk to us, and we'd love to help you power up your own powerful collaborative network. Thank you.